The wind, a restless spirit on the prairie, whispered secrets through the parched grass surrounding Elias Thorne's cabin, a solitary sentinel against the vast, indifferent sky. It was a language he understood, a dialect of loneliness and endurance. Inside, the hiss of bacon in a cast-iron skillet was a sharp counterpoint to the wind's mournful song, a sound Elias usually found comforting, a rhythm of survival. But today, it was a hollow beat, each sizzle a reminder of the emptiness the coming stage was supposed to fill. He'd sent away for a cook, a woman named Hattie, sturdy and sensible by the sound of her letter, a promise of warm meals and an end to the gnawing solitude that had been his only companion since his Martha, and little Tom were taken by the fever 3 winters past. The cabin still held their ghosts, faint impressions on the air, the scent of lavender Martha favored sometimes imagined on the breeze from the open window, the echo of a child's laughter in the way the floorboards creaked. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his gaze falling on the extra plate he'd set, a hopeful gesture that now felt like a taunt. The horizon shimmered under the relentless sun, a mirage of dust and distance. He squinted, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, tracing the faint ribbon of the stage road. It was late. He'd paid good money he'd scraped together from trapping and a small, stubborn patch of corn, for Hattie's passage. The thought of being cheated, of the coin vanishing into the maw of some faceless agency, tightened his jaw. He was a man accustomed to disappointment, a connoisseur of loss, but this small hope, this practical necessity, had taken root deeper than he'd allowed himself to realize. The distant rumble, at first a mere vibration in the soles of his worn boots, grew. He stepped onto the porch, a lean, weathered figure, his silence as much a part of him as the calluses on his hands. The stagecoach, a lumbering beast caked in the dun-colored dust of the plains, finally crested the rise, its approach slow, deliberate, like a harbinger of something inevitable. But as it drew closer, something was wrong. There was a commotion, not the usual grumbling of tired passengers, but a sharper, more agitated sound. He saw Henderson, the driver, arguing with someone, his face ruddy with exasperation. And then he saw her. Not Hattie, not the sturdy, sensible woman he'd envisioned. This woman was small, almost childlike, her dress torn and stained, her face pale beneath a layer of grime, framed by a cascade of dark, disheveled hair. Her eyes, wide and luminous, were pools of terror, reflecting the harsh sunlight like shattered glass. And clinging to her skirts, like desperate, silent barnacles, were 2 small children, twins by the look of them, their faces mirroring their mother's fear, their tiny hands clutching her fabric with a desperate strength. Henderson threw down a battered carpetbag at the woman's feet. "This is what they sent, Thorne. Said she's the one answers to the name you wrote. No Hattie on my manifest. Just her." And then he spat a stream of tobacco juice, narrowly missing Elias's boot. "Said she was prepaid." "Cook, you said?" "Looks more like baggage to me." The woman flinched at his words, drawing the children closer, her body a fragile shield. She held out a trembling hand, a creased, grimy piece of paper clutched within. It was his own letter, the one requesting Hattie, smudged and worn as if it had passed through 100 gentle hands. Elias looked from the paper to the woman, to the children whose eyes, too large for their small faces, stared up at him with a silent, profound accusation of the world's cruelty. He said nothing. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face. She didn't move to brush it away. His mind, a place usually ordered and pragmatic, was a maelstrom. This was not what he'd asked for. This was a burden, a complication he could ill afford. 3 more mouths to feed, 3 more bodies to shelter in a cabin already crowded with ghosts. His own loss rose like bile in his throat, the phantom weight of Tom in his arms, Martha's last, ragged breath. He should send them away. He had every right. Henderson was already clambering back onto his seat, eager to be rid of the problem. "Well," the driver called, impatient. The woman's gaze never left Elias. It was a look that didn't plead, didn't expect, but simply endured, a raw testament to a spirit battered but not yet broken. The children, still silent, pressed tighter against her. He saw the faint bruising on her cheek, the way her knuckles were white where she gripped their small shoulders. His cabin was small, his stores meager. Winter was a hard promise on these plains. But the image of turning them out, of sending them back into whatever hell they'd fled, settled like a stone in his gut. He thought of Martha's kindness, the way she'd taken stray kittens, mending their broken legs. He thought of Tom's small hand clutching his finger. He looked at the vast, empty prairie stretching out behind them, a canvas of indifference. He nodded, once. A curt, almost imperceptible movement. "They can stay." His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. For now Henderson shrugged, relieved. "Your funeral." Thorn. The stagecoach creaked and groaned, lumbering away, leaving a plume of dust that slowly settled, like a shroud, over the silent tableau on the porch. The woman didn't speak. She merely sank to her knees, her shoulders trembling, her arms encircling her children as if they were the last vestiges of solid ground in a world determined to swallow them whole. Elias turned, the extra plate on his table now a stark symbol not of hope, but of an unforeseen, unwelcome, yet undeniable responsibility. The wind sighed. He went inside, the smell of burnt bacon filling the small space. Elias cleared the remnants of his solitary meal, the cold grease congealing in the pan a small testament to the disruption that had just entered his life. He watched her from the corner of his eye as she remained on the porch, a small, huddled figure against the vastness, the twins nestled against her like frightened birds. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, colors that seemed to mimic the hidden wounds she carried. He knew that look, the haunted stillness. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough. He moved with a deliberate slowness, fetching water from the rain barrel, his movements economical, learned from years of solitary living. He didn't offer comfort, words were clumsy tools for the kind of pain she wore like a second skin. Instead, he worked. He brought in the small, rickety cot from the lean-to, the one Tom had outgrown just before the sickness. Dust motes danced in the fading light as he wiped it down with a damp rag. It wasn't much, but it was a space. He placed it in the far corner, away from the draft of the door, near the warmth of the hearth, though the fire was now just dying embers. She watched him, her eyes following his every move, unblinking, assessing. He felt her gaze like a physical weight. He took a spare blanket from his chest, threadbare but clean, and laid it on the cot. Then, he took his own rifle down from the pegs above the door, checked the load, and propped it beside his chair. A silent statement. Not of threat towards her, but of protection against whatever shadows stretched long from her past. Finally, he gestured, a brief movement of his chin towards the cabin's interior. Inside. Night comes. She hesitated for a long moment, then, with a visible effort, rose. She coaxed the children, her voice a low murmur, too soft for him to discern the words, but the tone was a balm of reassurance. They followed her, their small legs unsteady, their eyes still wide and wary, but with a fraction less terror than before. He ladled stew from the pot he'd made earlier, meant to last him days, into 3 bowls, adding a small piece of bread beside each. He set them on the table. He didn't invite her to eat. He simply provided. She guided the children to the table, lifting them onto the bench. They ate, slowly at first, then with a quiet urgency, their small hands surprisingly adept with the spoons he'd set out. She ate little herself, her gaze darting between her children and Elias, who sat in his usual chair, cleaning his rifle, the rhythmic click and scrape of metal on metal a strangely domestic sound in the charged silence. When they were finished, she gathered the bowls, her movements hesitant, as if expecting a reprimand. She looked towards the wash basin. He nodded. She washed them carefully, her hands moving with an ingrained efficiency. He noticed the raw, red skin around her knuckles, the faint, silver lines of old scars on her forearms. These were not the hands of a stranger to hardship. The days that followed settled into a quiet, almost monastic routine. Elias rose before dawn, tending to his small trap lines, checking the fences of his meager cornfield. When he returned, she would be up, the children usually still asleep on the cot, their small faces peaceful in slumber. She never spoke. Not a word. But she found ways to fill the spaces her silence left. She swept the cabin floor with a worn broom she'd found. She mended a tear in one of the children's shirts with thread pulled from her own tattered hem. She was a ghost in his house, a whisper of feminine presence that both unnerved and, in a way he wouldn't admit, soothed some ancient ache within him. He watched her with the children. Her patience was a deep, still well. She would sit with them, tracing patterns in the dust on the floor, her dark hair falling around them like a curtain, creating a small, private world. He saw the fierce, animal protectiveness in her eyes when a coyote howled too close to the cabin, the way her hand would instinctively go to the small, wooden crucifix she wore tucked inside her dress. The community, what little there was of it, noticed. On his infrequent trips to Henderson's Crossing for supplies, he felt their eyes. Old Man Hemlock, the storekeeper, his face a roadmap of prairie winds and suspicion, asked pointed questions. "Heard you got company, Thorn?" Unexpected company. Elias merely grunted, paying for his flour and salt. "Some say she's a runaway." "Some say worse." Hemlock persisted, polishing a non-existent spot on his counter. Elias met his gaze, his own eyes flat, unreadable. "She's here." It was all he would offer. The whispers bloomed like frost in the small settlement. Judgmental, curious, a little fearful. He ignored them. He was used to being an outsider. One afternoon, he returned to find one of the twins, the little girl, crying softly, a splinter in her tiny palm. Before he could react, Sarah was there, her movement swift and sure. She murmured to the child, a sound like gentle water over stones, and with a needle he hadn't known she possessed, she deftly removed the splinter. She held the child close, rocking her until the sobs subsided. He saw the raw tenderness in that moment, a mother's love, fierce and undeniable. Later, he found a piece of smooth willow wood and, with his whittling knife, carved a small, rough bird. He left it on the edge of the cot while they were outside. When he came back in, the bird was clutched in the little girl's hand. Sarah glanced at him, a fleeting look, but in it, he thought he saw a flicker, not of gratitude, perhaps, but of acknowledgement. A tiny crack in the wall of her silence. He remembered Martha's hands, tending to his own hurts, mending his clothes. He remembered the feel of Tom's small, trusting body asleep on his chest. These new presences in his cabin were not replacements, the dead could never be replaced. But they were something. A stirring in the stagnant pool of his grief. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer the empty, echoing silence of loss. It was a silence filled with unspoken things, with observation, with the quiet hum of 3 additional heartbeats under his roof. It was a fragile thing, this new quiet, easily broken. But for now, it held. The crisp air of late autumn carried the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves, a melancholic perfume that signaled the approaching hardship of winter. Elias worked with a grim determination, reinforcing the cabin walls, chopping firewood until his hands were raw, his muscles aching with a familiar burn. Each swing of the axe was a preparation, a defiance against the inevitable freeze. Sarah, whose name he still didn't know, he simply thought of her as her, had fallen into a rhythm alongside him, her silence no longer one of pure fear, but of a watchful, cautious industry. She had taken over the cooking, her skills surprising him. From his meager supplies, she conjured meals that were simple but nourishing, stretching ingredients with a resourcefulness born of necessity. The aroma of baking bread, something his cabin hadn't known since Martha, now occasionally filled the small space, a warm, comforting scent that warred with the ghosts of his past. The children, whom he'd silently named Will and Lily in his own mind for their quiet resilience, were beginning to show small signs of thawing. Lily would sometimes offer him a shy, fleeting smile. Will, more reserved, would watch him with an unnerving intensity, his small brow furrowed in concentration as Elias mended a harness or sharpened a tool. They still didn't speak to him, but their fear had lessened, replaced by a tentative curiosity. The peace, however, was as fragile as a skim of ice on early morning water. It shattered one blustery afternoon when a rider appeared on the horizon, not the familiar figure of Henderson on the stage, but a tall man on a powerful black horse, moving with an unnerving confidence. Elias saw him from the woodpile, his hand instinctively going to the axe handle. There was an arrogance in the man's posture, a sense of ownership in the way he surveyed Elias's small homestead. As the rider drew closer, Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The man was dressed in dark, well-made clothes, a stark contrast to the homespun attire of the settlers. His face was hard, his eyes like chips of obsidian. He reined in his horse a few yards from where Elias stood, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, lingering on the wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. "I'm looking for a woman," the man said, his voice smooth, cultured, yet laced with an undeniable menace. Dark hair, small. With 2 brats he didn't dismount. Elias said nothing, his stance unyielding, the axe still loose in his grip. The man's lips curled into a sneer. "Her name is Sarah. She's my property. Stolen goods, you might say. And I've come to collect what's mine." From inside the cabin, there was a small, sharp intake of breath, a sound almost swallowed by the wind, but Elias heard it. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was the shadow she had been fleeing. "There's no woman here by that name," Elias said, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. "You're mistaken." The man, Silas Blackwood he would later learn his name to be, chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, I don't think so. Word travels, even in this godforsaken wilderness. She was seen on the stage, heading this way. Henderson talks." For a price, his eyes narrowed, glinting with malice. "I have papers. She's indentured to me. Ran off owing me considerable service. And the children, well, they belong with their mother, don't they?" He patted a leather satchel tied to his saddle. Elias didn't doubt he had papers. Forged or real, it didn't matter. Men like Blackwood always had papers. He thought of Sarah's haunted eyes, the bruises he'd glimpsed, the raw fear that had clung to her like a shroud. "She's not here," Elias repeated, his voice harder this time. "You'll find nothing here. Best you move on." Blackwood's smile vanished. "I don't like being lied to, sod buster." He leaned forward slightly. "I know she's in there. I can smell her fear." He paused, letting his threat hang in the air. "I'll be back. And when I return, I expect my property to be ready. Or there will be consequences. For you. And for her." He wheeled his horse, the animal rearing slightly, then galloped away, disappearing over the rise as quickly as he'd come, leaving behind an oppressive silence, thicker and more threatening than before. Elias stood for a long moment, the axe heavy in his hand. He then walked to the cabin door. Sarah was pressed against the far wall, her face ashen, the children clinging to her, their small bodies trembling. Her silence was broken now, not by words, but by ragged, shallow breaths of pure terror. He saw the imprint of Blackwood's cruelty on her as clearly as if it were branded on her skin. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He simply propped the axe by the door, took down his rifle, and began to meticulously clean and oil it, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. He checked his meager supply of ammunition. Later that evening, as a cold rain began to lash against the cabin, there was a soft knock at the door. It was Martha Henderson, the stage driver's wife, a stern but kind woman whose infrequent visits usually involved the trading of goods or news. She carried a covered basket. She looked from Elias to Sarah, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "Heard Silas Blackwood was sniffing around," she said, her voice low. "Man's trouble, always has been. Henderson told me about the arrangement." She glanced at Sarah, who shrank back slightly. Martha Henderson set the basket on the table. "Brought some fresh bread. And some broth. For the little ones." She looked directly at Sarah. "You're safe here, girl. Elias Thorne is a good man. Stubborn as a mule, but good." It was a small gesture, a quiet act of defiance against the fear Blackwood sowed, but it felt monumental. Sarah looked up, her eyes filled with a desperate, fragile hope. She couldn't speak, but she inclined her head, a gesture of profound gratitude. Martha Henderson nodded curtly to Elias. "Keep your powder dry, Thorne." She left as quietly as she'd come. Elias looked at Sarah. Her fear was still there, a living thing in the room, but beneath it, he saw a flicker of something else. A resolve, perhaps. Or the dawning realization that she wasn't entirely alone in this fight. He bolted the door, the sound echoing in the small cabin. The storm outside raged, but inside, a different kind of storm was gathering. The days that followed Blackwood's visit were taut with unspoken tension, the air thick with anticipation. Elias moved with a grim purpose, his senses heightened, every snap of a twig, every distant call of a bird, a potential threat. He slept little, his nights spent by the window, the rifle close at hand, watching the moonlit prairie for any sign of movement. Sarah, too, was changed. The terror still lurked in the depths of her eyes, but it was overlaid now with a quiet watchfulness, a steely determination. She kept the children close, her movements economical, her silence no longer just a shield of trauma but also a form of vigilance. She would often pause in her chores, her head tilted, listening, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. She began to mend Elias's clothes, her stitches small and neat, an unspoken offering. He found a worn shirt laid out on his cot, a tear in the sleeve expertly repaired. He said nothing, but he wore it the next day. A fragile thread of alliance was being woven between them, spun from shared danger and unspoken understanding. The children, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, were quieter than usual, their play subdued. Lily would often bring Elias a smooth stone or a fallen feather, laying it carefully on the table beside him as he worked, small, silent gifts. Will would sit by the hearth, drawing patterns in the ash with a stick, his small face serious. The community remained a distant murmur. Henderson, on his next stage run, avoided Elias's eye, a clear sign that Blackwood's influence, all the fear of it, was strong. Only Martha Henderson offered a silent nod of support when she passed by their homestead on her way to visit a neighbor, a gesture that spoke volumes in the climate of fear. The expected confrontation came on a gray, windswept morning, the sky the color of lead. Elias was splitting logs when he saw them, 3 riders this time, Blackwood in the lead, flanked by 2 rough-looking men Elias didn't recognize, hired muscle by their thuggish appearance. He dropped the axe, his hand going to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, a relic from a past he rarely spoke of. He'd been a lawman once, a long time ago, before Martha and Tom, before the grief had hollowed him out. Some instincts, he found, never truly died. He moved to the porch, positioning himself before the cabin door. "Blackwood," he called, his voice carrying over the moan of the wind. "I told you." "She's not here." Blackwood dismounted, his companions fanning out slightly, their hands near their own weapons. "We both know that's a lie." Thorne, his smile was predatory. "I've come for what's mine. The woman. The children. And a little compensation for my trouble." He gestured to one of his men. "Get them." The man started towards the cabin, a brutish grin on his face. Elias drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked a sharp, definitive sound in the tense air. "That's far enough." The man froze. Blackwood's eyes hardened. "You'd risk your life for her, Thorne? A runaway serving girl?" "She's nothing." Elias's gaze didn't waver. "She's under my protection." Just then, the cabin door opened. Sarah stepped out, her face pale but resolute. She held a small, worn Bible in one hand, her knuckles white. The children were not visible behind her. "Silas," she said, her voice surprisingly clear, though it trembled slightly. It was the first time Elias had heard her speak more than a single, choked sound. The name fell from her lips like a curse. Blackwood looked surprised, then pleased. "Ah, Sarah. Sensible girl. Come along now. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I am not your property, Silas," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I fulfilled my indenture. This Bible, my mother's, it has the dates. The contract was for 5 years. I served 7 inch." She held it out, her hand shaking. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "That little book? That means nothing. I have the official papers." "They are forgeries," Sarah stated, her gaze unwavering. "You changed the dates after my father died, after there was no one left to protect me from you. You thought I was ignorant, that I couldn't read." Elias watched her, a strange sense of pride stirring within him. This was her voice, found in the crucible of fear. "She speaks the truth," Elias said, his eyes still on Blackwood. "Now, I suggest you and your men ride out. There's nothing for you here." Blackwood's face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this, Thorn. Both of you." He lunged for Sarah. Elias moved faster than he thought possible, stepping in front of her, his arm knocking Blackwood's grasping hand aside. One of Blackwood's men drew his gun. Time seemed to slow. Elias fired, not to kill, but to disarm. His bullet struck the man's gun hand, sending the pistol flying. The man howled in pain, clutching his bleeding wrist. The other hired gun, seeing the cold, deadly precision in Elias's eyes, hesitated. Blackwood, momentarily stunned, recovered his fury. He drew a wicked-looking knife from his belt and lunged again, this time at Elias. Sarah screamed, a raw, piercing sound. Elias sidestepped the thrust, the blade slicing through the fabric of his sleeve, drawing a thin line of blood on his forearm. He brought the barrel of his Colt down hard on Blackwood's temple. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The remaining henchman, seeing his employer down and his companion wounded, decided he wasn't paid enough for this. He helped his injured cohort onto his horse, and they fled, casting fearful glances back at the silent, formidable figure on the porch. Silence descended, broken only by the whistling wind and Sarah's ragged breathing. Elias lowered his pistol, his chest heaving. He looked at the blood welling from the cut on his arm. It was a shallow wound, but it stung. Sarah rushed to his side, her earlier fear replaced by a desperate concern. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She tore a strip of fabric from her apron, her hand surprisingly steady as she pressed it against the wound. Her touch was gentle, hesitant. Their eyes met. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls between them, built of grief and mistrust, seemed to dissolve. He saw not a runaway, but a woman of immense courage. She saw not just a protector, but a man willing to bleed for her. He nodded towards Blackwood's prone form. "He'll wake soon. We need to tie him up. Henderson can take him to the marshal in Willow Creek when the stage comes through." She nodded, her eyes still holding his. The unspoken had finally found its voice, not in words, but in a shared ordeal, a common victory. The children, Will and Lily, appeared in the doorway, their small faces etched with fear and awe. Sarah hurried to them, gathering them into her arms, murmuring reassurances. Elias watched them, the ache in his arm a dull throb, but a different feeling, something warm and unfamiliar, spread through his chest. It felt a little like hope. The prairie wind, no longer a harbinger of threat, now carried the scent of wet earth and the distant promise of spring. Weeks had passed since the confrontation with Blackwood. Henderson, visibly shaken but surprisingly compliant after Elias laid out the facts and presented Sarah's worn Bible with its meticulously kept records, had taken the bound and still furious Silas Blackwood away on the stage. Word eventually trickled back that the marshal in Willow Creek, a man known for his fairness, had listened to Sarah's story, examined her evidence, and recognized Blackwood as a known exploiter with a history of similar deceptions. Blackwood was being held, his reign of intimidation over Sarah finally at an end. A quiet peace settled over Elias Thorne's homestead, a peace earned in silence and sealed in a moment of shared peril. The rhythms of life found a new, softer cadence. Elias tilled a larger patch of ground than usual, the rich soil yielding to his plow, holding the promise of a more abundant harvest. Sarah worked beside him, not as a servant, but as a partner. She planted a small herb garden near the cabin door, her hands, once raw and scarred, now gentle as they coaxed life from the earth. The children, Will and Lily, were no longer silent shadows. Laughter, tentative at first, then freer, began to echo around the small cabin. Lily, her shyness receding, would chatter to Elias as he mended tools, her small voice a bright thread in the tapestry of their days. Will, still more reserved, would follow him to the woodpile, attempting to lift small logs with a determined frown, his small face a miniature of Elias's own focused intensity. Sarah's voice, once a choked whisper, now filled the cabin with quiet conversation, with softly sung lullabies for the children. She told Elias fragments of her past, not the horrors of her servitude under Blackwood, but small, precious memories of her own mother, of a childhood before the shadows fell. She spoke of her parents' small farm, of learning to read from the family Bible, the very book that had been her salvation. Elias listened, his own silence no longer a barrier but an invitation. He found himself speaking of Martha, of Tom, not with the raw, consuming grief of before, but with a gentle melancholy, sharing their memories as one might share a treasured possession. He told Sarah about Martha's laughter, like wind chimes, and Tom's fascination with the stars. Sarah listened, her eyes soft with an empathy that needed no words. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in breathtaking hues, Lily asleep in Sarah's lap, while leaning against Elias's knee, tracing patterns on his worn trousers, Sarah spoke. "Elias," she began, her voice hesitant, "the children, they have started to call this place home." He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught the strands of her dark hair, at the peaceful expression on her face. He saw the strength there, the resilience that had weathered so many storms. "It is home," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He reached out, his calloused hand covering hers where it rested on Lily's sleeping form. It was a simple gesture, but it held the weight of all they had endured, all they had become to each other. Her fingers curled around his, a silent acceptance. The community, once a source of suspicion and judgment, began to thaw. Martha Henderson was a frequent visitor, bringing pies and news, her sharp eyes missing nothing of the quiet transformation at the Thorne homestead. Old man Hemlock, his curiosity satisfied and his respect grudgingly won, even offered Elias a favorable trade on seeds. Neighbors, who had once kept their distance, now nodded in greeting, sometimes stopping to offer a helping hand or share news. Elias expanded the cabin, adding a small room for the children. He worked with a renewed vigor, the sound of his hammer, and saw a cheerful rhythm against the backdrop of the prairie. He built a sturdy new fence around Sarah's garden, protecting her herbs and vegetables from wandering deer. He mended the old rocking chair that had been Martha's, sanding down the rough edges, strengthening its frame. One evening, he presented it to Sarah. She looked at it, then at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered. She sat in it, while climbing into her lap, and began to hum a soft tune, the chair creaking gently, a sound of peace, of belonging. The tattered blanket Lily had always clutched was now neatly patched with fabric from one of Martha's old dresses, a blending of past and present. Sarah still wore her small wooden crucifix, but the terror that had once been its constant companion was gone, replaced by a quiet faith. The empty spaces in Elias Thorne's cabin, once filled with ghosts and silence, were now vibrant with life, with the murmur of conversation, the laughter of children, the quiet rhythm of a family forged not by blood, but by courage, resilience, and the slow, steady blossoming of love. And reader, if you have ever known the desolation of a heart emptied by loss, or the crushing weight of a world that seeks to define you by your vulnerability, then you know the profound miracle of a second chance. You understand that sometimes, the greatest strength is found in the quiet refusal to break, and the deepest connections are forged in the fires of shared adversity. For in the vast, indifferent expanse of the prairie, or indeed, in the often unforgiving landscape of any human life, it is the hand that reaches out in the darkness, the voice that speaks truth against oppression, and the heart that dares to hope again, that truly cultivates the wilderness into a home. Elias had waited for a cook, a practical solution to a solitary life. What arrived was a storm, a challenge, and ultimately, a salvation. A bride he hadn't sought, with children who mirrored the family he'd lost, had shown him that the seeds of a new life can take root even in the most barren ground, watered by courage and warmed by the unexpected sunrise of love. And in their quiet, shared existence, under the watchful eyes of the prairie sky, they found not just survival, but a profound and lasting peace, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to mend, to build, and to begin anew.